Hey everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the MIDI in my studio. I've got basically three separate sections of the studio: the desk, the left side of the desk, and the right side of the desk, that are all interconnected with MIDI and RTP MIDI. And I cover all the MIDI things. So today I will show you how it's all connected and how RTP MIDI works with the iConnectivity interfaces. First off, I'll show you just a little quick refresher lesson in case you don't know what all the connections are on these interfaces. All three of these iConnectivity interfaces share similar connections. So the most obvious one is they have DIN MIDI, and that would be 5-pin DIN cables, the same MIDI that's been around since the early 80s. It's one directional, so a keyboard that has an in and out, you'd use two of these to go to it. The other thing that they have is they have USB host ports, where you'd plug a cord like this in, a USB-A plug. That would be for plugging in USB compatible devices. Now they have to be class compliant, which anymore most things are, so it'd be like a MIDI controller, a synth with a USB jack on it, anything like that. And all of them have a few of those, up to quite a few, that you can expand if you have like a USB hub attached to it. The other thing they all have is a USB-B port or more, and that is for connecting a device like your computer to it. And that is kind of the traditional way a MIDI interface would work. You'd connect that to your computer, the ports would go into it, but it gets a lot more interesting than that with these. Okay, and the last thing they all have is an Ethernet port, which you'd connect like a Cat5, Cat6, what have you, cable to it, like this, and that is network MIDI, called RTP MIDI. And it lets you use MIDI over Ethernet for long distances, and it carries a whole bunch of ports at once, and I'll explain more how that works. So now let me show you all three interfaces and how I've got them hooked up. There's the iConnectivity Mio XM that is on the desk. That has 4 DIN MIDI ins and outs. It has USB host ports for up to 8 devices. I don't remember how many physical ports it has, but you can just expand them with a USB hub. It has a USB-B port right here for connecting to a computer or an iPad or some other device that can host it. And then the RTP port, which allows you to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 MIDI ports over Ethernet. And what I mean by a MIDI port in the traditional sense, if you look at a MIDI DIN cable, that can carry 16 channels of MIDI, so that would be like a single port. Well, with RTP MIDI, in the case of the Mio XM, it can have 12 of those, and that's in or out, or both, over the Ethernet cable, which is cool. Another thing to note, when you connect it to your computer, in the software they call it USB DAW. Okay, it shows up in your computer as 16 MIDI ports. So like if you plug it in, make sure it's all installed, open your DAW, it'll show up as 16 ins and outs. You can actually assign those to any of these ins and outs all you want to. So you might be thinking, well, wait, there's only 4 DIN MIDI plugs. Well, 4 of them can be those or not. The 8 USB host ports or the RTP MIDI ports or the DIN MIDI, it doesn't matter. They're all interchangeable. So basically, in the software, which I'll show you later, you just tell it, I want this device, this port, to be number 1 in the DAW. Okay, now we're over here at the right side of my desk. That's where the modular synth is, couple walls of synths, table full of stuff, all sorts of things. So on this side, I have a iConnectivity Mio XL. And it is just like the XM, but with lots more ports. I will tell you how many. So it has 8 DIN MIDI ins, 12 DIN MIDI outs over 5-pin MIDI. It can host 10 USB class compliant devices. It has a computer port, just like the other one, for connecting your computer or your other device. and it has RTP MIDI. Its RTP MIDI can support up to 22 MIDI ports over your network. All right, so otherwise it's the same sort of thing as the XM, it just has a lot more. Okay, moving over here. So over here on the left side of the desk, we have the Mio 10. This one's not in production anymore, but it works very similar to the other ones. It on DIN MIDI, it has 10 ins and 10 outs. USB host, it supports up to 10 class compliant USB devices. And RTP MIDI, it does 4 ports, I believe. And the weird thing about this one, for the DAW or computer port, it actually has 2, so it supports you like connecting a computer and an iPad to it or whatnot. So that's one interesting thing. Another thing to note is other hardware I have. So behind the racks there is, on both sides, there's some MIDI through boxes, and I'll put a link to the one I have. It's a really cool little kit. It's like 1 in, 5 out. It just hooks to a USB power supply. They're super cool. I think I have 2 of those just for splitting signals. I also have all this older stuff too. Sorry about the cords in the way. This is the Digital Music Corp MX8. It's a MIDI patch bay processor. So it kind of does a lot what the newer things do, but this isn't actually an interface. It has 6 DIN ins and 8 DIN outs, and it just allows you to split, combine, merge, filter, all that kind of stuff. So that's one of the oldest things I still own. It's from like the early 90s, I think. And then these 3 Roland units aren't actually hooked up at the moment. They are kind of like this. So they aren't interfaces. They're too old to be that. But this one's a patch bay. This one's a separator. It allows you to do splits with your MIDI controller and stuff. This one displays on this cool little LED thing. It's good for troubleshooting. It also is a through box, that kind of stuff. Those aren't hooked up. The MX8 I'm pretty much only using for more through ports right now, so I'm just using one of the inputs to several of the outputs. I think mostly for like effects, like pedals and stuff like that. Okay, I'm back to the desk. So one other thing to note is why would you want to use DIN MIDI over the USB host ports and that sort of thing? Because I have a combination here. Well, typically I use DIN MIDI if it has it. I've just found that it just works, and I have lots of MIDI cables, so I might as well just do that, and I have lots of MIDI ports. There are a few things that I use the USB host ports. One weird example is the ARP Odyssey, the Korg ARP Odyssey up there. It has USB MIDI and a DIN input, but no output. Well, that allows me to use it as a controller too. So if I use the USB host port, it's in and out. I wouldn't have a MIDI output otherwise. It's kind of a weird example. A lot of other things might use MIDI. I think over here I've got the Squarp Instruments Hermod over USB MIDI, and I've got a couple other things. Typically, I'll use MIDI DIN, like I said. An instance that you have to keep in mind, so if your synth has USB MIDI and it has an editor, a good example would be over here. So over there on the wall is the Argon 8X, and in the rack is the Cobalt 8M by Modal. Those both have really good editors on the computer. So if you plug the USB MIDI into your iConnectivity interface, your editor's not going to see that. It's the interface is seeing it as a MIDI device, and that's it. It doesn't transfer to the computer in any way, so you can use the editor. So in the instance of those two, I hook the DIN MIDI up, and then I connect the USB directly to the computer so I can use the editors. Same goes for the Moog, Minotaur, and Siren. I use those editors all the time too. So I just use the DIN MIDI to the interface and then the USB directly to the computer just so I can use their editors. Over here, I don't think I have anything connected to the USB host devices. Okay, so how do I connect everything to the devices? Well, like I said, it's a combination of things. For the most part, if there's enough DIN MIDI ports, everything gets its own DIN MIDI port, or if I'm using USB port hooked directly to the interface. Some things, like the stuff on the table, for example, I'll actually use the MIDI throughs on those just because they're all next to each other, and it just makes more sense. A lot, if not most, probably most everything in this room, with the exception of my old sound modules, like from the 90s, is not multi-timbral, so I don't need more than one MIDI channel for it. There's a few exceptions. So as you'll see here in a bit, I like to use my Square Pyramid MIDI sequencer to play the synths without the computer, or just sequence things without the computer. I use it for like laying down ideas a lot. And so it only has 2 MIDI outputs. So in order to access almost every synth, everything does have its own MIDI channel. And I did that so I can use it either with the computer or with the Pyramid, either one. It makes it a little bit more complicated, but it also helps kind of consolidate things. Like over there in the rack, they're pretty much using MIDI throughs on all that stuff. They're all just chained together or using one of my through boxes behind it. And then they're all on their own channel, so it doesn't matter anyway. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I know it's a little bit confusing. So next up, I'm going to show you the software on the screen and how I set it all up. And the important thing to note is, of all 3 interfaces, only the one on the desk actually is plugged into the computer over the USB jack. And all 3 of them are hooked to the network cables. So I have network cables running through my walls. When we built the room, they all go into the closet just to a normal network switch. And so they're all connected to the computer just over the same cable as my internet comes in on, because it doesn't take up much bandwidth. And that's how the other 2 interfaces get to the computer so I can route things. Okay, so now let me show you that part, and I'll show you all the ins and outs of how it all comes into the computer and gets routed. Okay, so here is Oracle for X Series, which is the iConnectivity software. And as you can see here, I've got my 3 interfaces. So like I said before, the Mio XM, this one is actually hooked up USB to the computer directly. These 2 are only RTP. This one is also RTP. So what that allows me to do is, through RTP, get all the stuff hooked to these 2 interfaces over to the computer into my DAW. So we'll look at the MIDI routing for the Mio XM. So this top part on the left here shows the DIN. So basically the left side are your inputs, and if you click on one, it shows you over here where it's going to go to. So you think of it's into here, out to over here. So DIN MIDI 1, so I click on that, and it's telling me where I want it to go. Do I want it to send it to another MIDI port? This is, do I want to send it to one of the USB host ports? Do I want to send it to the DAW? And do I want to send it to RTP MIDI? So in the case of DIN MIDI 1, that's the front panel one. I use it for if I'm just setting something temporarily on the desk, so it's routed to the DAW. And I'll explain the RTP stuff last. And then I've got port 2 is the Pyramid input and the Pyramid output. Port 3 is the other Pyramid input, and then the output is used for effects on the table here. Like I have various effects here that sync to MIDI. One weird thing you'll notice, if your input and output port are different devices, like in the case of these, you kind of have to get funky with the naming a little bit. That's just how it works. They're like a pair. The way you name them is a pair. So I had to kind of double up on the names. And DIN MIDI N4 is my A70 MIDI controller that's here on the desk. And that's, as you can see, is going to a DAW port as well. Okay. Then it's also going to the Pyramid. More on that later. So MIDI host ports, I am using one. So the Pyramid is actually plugged into the MIDI host port. So I can also access another round of MIDI, 16 channels of MIDI from the Pyramid from this host port. I'm not using that right now, but I could. So technically I could have 3 outputs coming out of the Pyramid, going to different things. USB DAW, that would be what my DAW sees when on the computer. So you just label these, and this is from the DAW, because this is an input. So from the DAW, DIN 1 goes to DIN 1. From the DAW, nothing there. This one goes to the effects sync. This one goes to various things. And then when you get down here, the rest of these from the DAW go to the various RTP ports mostly. And in the case of this one, my USB host port pyramid. And then these are more RTP. I've got a bunch of RTP set up here. And then so down here is my RTP. So what this means is I labeled it keyboard wall. So that refers to the keyboard wall on my left. So like I said before, I lump things together into groups because it just makes it easier. So basically on my left, that is the 4 keyboards that are mounted on the wall. They all have their own MIDI channel, so they won't interfere with each other. That is the synths in the rack on my left. That is, what's that say? Oh, the rack mount sound modules, the old ones, and my old Link keytar. So that's all left side, those 3 RTP ports. This RTP port is connected to the right side to the Mio XL, and that's the keyboards on the wall, stuff on the tabletop, stuff in the modular, specifically the black sequencer, the Erica Synth black sequencer, specifically the Hermod, and specifically my iRig keys over there. So you're probably wondering what the heck all that means. Well, there's 2 different ways you can set up RTP MIDI. You can actually have, so say I have my Mio XL over behind me, set up various ports going to my computer. Well, you can actually have your computer auto connect to it, and it shows up as ports, and it would show up in your DAW. And that way works, and I used to actually do it that way, and you can actually set them all to auto connect to the computer. I found it to be a little unreliable. They would connect, and sometimes a couple of them wouldn't, and there'd be no rhyme or reason why. So I kind of gave up on that. So the other way you can do it, you can connect your RTP ports directly to another RTP device. So in the way I'm doing it is I have, it looks like, so 3 from the Mio 10, three ports connected directly to the Mio XM, no computer involved. And then I have a lot more than that. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 ports from the Mio XL behind me connected directly to the Mio XM on the desk. And that's why I have to use some, the negative of that is you have to use some of the ports for that. Whereas if you had them connected directly to your computer, you would have those available for something else. There's so many, it doesn't really matter. So what that looks like, I'll show you on the Mio XM RTP screen here. So this shows all my ports here. So when you turn this on, so I'll turn on number 10 here, it gives you this ID, the Mio XM ESA-10. You copy that, you set it as a responder. I'll turn it off. And then you go over to whatever you're connecting it to. So say I wanted to connect it to, sorry, wrong button, to this one, then you turn it on as initiator, then paste in that address, hit save, and it just magically finds it already plugged in on your network. It works super well. You set it up once, save the preset, and it just works. Like, the cool thing is, I don't even have to have the computer on. Like, the computer can be completely shut off. I turn on all 3 interfaces. The RTP ports just talk to each other, and they're connected as on the screen. So why that's important is because I was saying before how I like to use my pyramid sequencer sometimes to lay down ideas. That doesn't involve the computer being on at all. So how I have that set up, and the reason I have all this stuff set up the way I do, is basically I have my MIDI controller on the desk, being the master controller for the pyramid. So that just goes directly into that, not hard at all. But then each side of the room basically has the synths grouped, as you saw on here, like keyboards. So that means the keyboard wall on my left, they all have their own MIDI channel. Well, I can just send info from the pyramid with no computer on all the way through the network over to those keyboards, and it just works. The way that works is, so you take this DIN MIDI in to here, that is the pyramid, output A, and I have it routed to something called RTP Connect. RTP MIDI MIO10 Connect. So my last two ports of RTP on this XM, MIO XM, are used to just direct connections to the left side of the room and the right side of the room. So if I want to use my pyramid, its output A goes to the MIO10 Connect, and the MIO10 Connect, I'll go over to that. Here's the MIO10, and you scroll down to MIO10 Connect, which is called Disconnect on this side. And basically, it takes that port and routes it to all the relevant synths, which all have their own MIDI channel, so they don't interfere with each other. And that way, so basically, follow me here. I play a note on the A70, goes into the pyramid. I tell the pyramid to play the Prophet Rev 2. So then it goes into the interface. It knows to go to, because I'm on port A on a certain MIDI channel, it goes to this MIO10 Connect, sends it over the MIDI data to the MIO10 and over to that wall of synths, and it's on the same channel, and it plays it. And it's all like, there's no latency that's discernible from this whole thing. Likewise, if I want to play something on the right side, so behind me, there is one called MIO XL Connect. And so the second port out of the pyramid, there's a physical DIN MIDI port, goes to MIO XL Connect. MIO XL Connect, if you go look at the MIO XL routing, and I scroll down to that one, it says RTP Desk, just like the other side. And it sends MIDI to all the things. They all have their own channel, and I can play any of those from my pyramid. I know it's difficult to understand, and believe you me, I have to wrap my head around it every time I have to mess with it. So basically what all this means is, between those RTP ports that connect directly to the interface from all sides, I can have my computer off, use my Squart Pyramid MIDI sequencer, no computer involved, and it just works. Likewise, I can have the computer on, and because of that DIN port on the software, I have access to all the synths. So once again, the DAW port, so they're all grouped into keyboard wall. That sends it to this port called RTP Keyboards. If I go over to my MIO10, look at the RTP port called Keyboards, it sends it to all the keyboards on that side of the room, as well as some syncing stuff. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to show you before I wrap this up. If you're on a Mac and you go to the Audio MIDI Setup button there, and open up the MIDI network setup, that is all built into a Mac. And so you're able to access all these RTP ports. So like I have all the interfaces on right now, and you can see all the RTP ports that I have enabled just show up here. And so if you're in a situation where you want to connect directly to the computer, like I was talking about earlier, you would add a session, and I believe you enable it and then name it the same as you do in the Oracle for X series, and that's how you can set it up to auto connect. I don't remember exactly because I stopped doing it that way. But another really cool thing is, so I am able to connect to other computers. So I have a PC here, down here on the floor, my teenage engineering computer case, a PC I built, and we've used it to play back some video on an in-studio thing we did. So I wanted it to be able to play the video back. It doesn't even have a MIDI interface hooked to it. All I had to do was connect it to my network, the same switch that everything else is on. I made an RTP session called Computer Orange Connect, and then on the Windows PC, there's a third-party app you can install that adds something that looks pretty much exactly like this. It's free. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I'll put a link down in the description. I set up that port connection. So when I turn that PC on, it connects to this RTP port, no MIDI interface on that computer at all, and I can send MIDI to and from that computer just because it's hooked to the network, and it works really slick. So that's something else to keep in mind. So if you have more than one computer, or you maybe have a dedicated computer to run some old virtual synth or something that you love, you don't even need a MIDI interface for that other computer. If you're using RTP and it has a network card in it, you can set up RTP MIDI between two computers and send MIDI to and from the computers, and it works really well. So anyway, that was just something I wanted to point out. I'll put a link to that software for the PC that basically brings up this same RTP screen. I hope all that makes sense. I know it comes across really confusing, but if you just think of each port being able to go anywhere and from anywhere into the computer or not, it's completely fluid, basically. So as soon as you wrap your head around the routing part of it, you can send anything to anywhere. And because the RTP MIDI is over network, you can run it really long distances. So there's really long cables running through my walls to the closet. And also, like if you're in a stage situation, you can run them across the stage to the sides and no problem at all. MIDI cables wouldn't make it so well doing that, or USB cables either. This has been the best, easiest, always works solution of my studio. It took me, like I said, it took me a while to set it up. I had to make spreadsheets. There's also so many spreadsheets saying this device is on this input and this output, and it's on this channel, and I'm putting it to this RTP group. Yes, there's a lot of planning, but if you plan it right, it can totally work, and it does for me every single time. So, thank you for watching. I'm sure you'll have questions. Feel free to leave them in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you.